Welcome to the Dr. Wyatt Show podcast, where developing a long-lasting, happy relationship is the status symbol to achieve, and following my tools is one path to help get you there. I'm your host, Dr. Wyatt Fisher, a licensed psychologist specializing in couples counseling. If you would like to learn my tools, if you'd like to get away from the hustle and bustle, if you want to spend the entire day with me, helping you step by step resolve your resentments and rekindle your love, attend my Total Marriage Refresh Conference coming up in Denver, Colorado, March 29th. You don't want to miss it. If you live near Colorado or if you want to travel to Colorado, this is my signature conference. I've been doing it for over 10 years. It's one of my favorite things to do because I get to teach all day, I get to help couples all day, and it's a transformative experience if you want to get away and give your marriage undivided attention. The link is in the show notes, and you can also go to my website, drwyattfisher.com, and click on Colorado Marriage Retreats. So today I'm talking about how I avoid becoming defensive in my relationship as a couples therapist. I've been doing these kind of episodes recently where I'm sharing a little more from my personal marriage because I think that can be fascinating for people to hear. Because often you listen to people like me and you think, I wonder what they do. I wonder how they show up. I wonder how they handle this in their relationship. And I try my best to have integrity by practicing what I preach. It doesn't mean I'm perfect. Doesn't mean I sometimes blow it. But on average, I really try to stick with the very tactics and principles and skills that I teach others. I try to practice them in my own marriage. So again, today I'm going to be talking about what do I do when my wife gives me a complaint, when she tells me I'm doing something wrong, something that's bothering her, something that's frustrating her. One of the first things I try to do is remember the mindset that marriage is the ultimate refinement tool. And what that means is that my wife sees me better than anybody else. She sees my strengths. She sees my blind spots. She sees my growth areas. And therefore, when she has a complaint, when she has a critique, I need to remember this is coming from someone who sees me better than anyone else in the world sees me. Now, it doesn't mean 100% of what she says is accurate, because some of what she says might be circumstance, and she may think it's me, but it's actually circumstance. Some of it might be her own sensitivities or triggers from her past that she's projecting onto me, and that's not my fault. But I can guarantee the majority of the time when she gives me feedback, there is a kernel of truth. So that's one thing I do that can help me not get defensive is remember this feedback is coming from someone who knows me better than anybody, and marriage is the ultimate refinement tool through feedback from my wife to me and vice versa. Another thing that can help me not get defensive is when my wife is using the tools. Now, it's a little tricky being a couples therapist because my wife does not want me to act like the marriage expert in our own marriage. That rubs her wrong, understandably. So it can be a little tricky at times getting her on board with the tools, but by and large, she does follow the tools. And so obviously, if she is bringing up her complaint in one of the tools, such as the bullseye or the reunite tool or the love buckets, then I'm going to respond a lot better. That's why those tools are designed so that the person receiving the constructive feedback has a much more pleasant experience and does not get defensive. So that's a second way that can help me not get defensive is if my wife is using the tools when she delivers the complaint. But let's imagine she doesn't use the tools. Let's imagine she blindsides me. Let's imagine that she brings up a frustration she's been having with me and she's been bottling it up. She forgets to use the tools and she just lets me have it. She just tells me what it is. This happened for us a couple years ago, so I'm going to share a real life example. Then I'm going to share with you the steps I went through in my mind to help me from getting defensive. So the complaint that she made was that I was overworking and therefore we weren't having enough quality time together. That was her complaint. She didn't use a tool. She just came out and said it, and it had been bottling up for her for several months, and then she told me what that complaint was. So here are the 6 things I went through in my head over the next day as I was mulling over her complaint. Number 6, I had to remind myself of my progress because I had recently been scheduling a weekend getaway for her and I so that we could have some more quality time. So that was progress I was trying to work on. I also was in the process of eliminating 2 evening courses I had been doing to free up our evenings together. So that was also progress I had been doing. So that was one thing I had to remind myself of, was my progress. Second thing I had to remind myself of was my upbringing. Growing up, I was raised in a culture where we worked a lot. I was either washing the cars or staining the fence or cutting the grass or cleaning the toilets or vacuuming on a regular basis. We worked a lot. Both my parents were raised on farms, and so they were raised working a lot, and they raised my sister and I to work a lot. And so that's just how I'm wired. And so I'm wired to work a lot. I can take a lot of work. I have a really strong work ethic, and I can take on and maintain much more than most people because I was raised in an environment where work was normal. My parents also relaxed and had fun, but it was after all the work was done. So I had to remind myself this complaint from my wife that I'm overworking was not all my fault because I was raised in an environment where I worked a lot. Third thing I had to remind myself of was my circumstances. This complaint from my wife that I was overworking wasn't all my fault because of my circumstances. And the circumstances at the time is I was really hustling, trying to save up money for our kids for college so that we didn't have to go into debt with student loans. That was a high value for me because I had student loans for 20 plus years from my graduate school, and I didn't want our kids to have the same burden. And so I was working extra hard to eliminate that for them so that we could cash flow their college experience so that they could graduate without any debt. So that was a circumstance going on in my life, which also made this complaint that I was overworking not all my fault. Number 4, I had to remind myself of my wife's contribution. What was she doing that was making this worse? Because again, her complaint was that I was overworking and therefore we weren't having enough quality time together. So one way she was making this worse that I had to remind myself of was that at night when I was available and when I would come out to hang out, she was busy working herself. She was on her computer doing her work. So the moments we did have together, instead of her really cherishing those and making the most of those, she was doing her own work. And so that was making this worse. That was contributing to the problem. A fifth thing I had to remind myself of was her upbringing. So my wife was raised in Hawaii, going to the beach, having barbecues. She didn't have her first job until she was around 22, and she didn't ever have to do chores growing up. So she had a completely different upbringing than mine. So she's much better than I am at relaxing, seizing the moment, taking it easy, having leisure time. She's much better at that because that's how she was raised. And because she was raised like that, it's more taxing for her if our life gets too hectic and if I'm working too much because it's such a stark contrast compared to how she was raised. So I also had to remember that. My wife's upbringing was influencing how she was experiencing me overworking. Now, number 6, the final thing I had to remind myself of, which is the most important, but you can't start there. I only could remind myself of number 6, this last piece, after I reminded myself about my progress, my upbringing, my circumstances, her contribution, and her past. Once I was able to go through all those pieces in my mind, then I was primed to do number 6. Number 6, which is the most important, is I had to think about what about this complaint is my fault. Despite my progress, despite my upbringing, despite my circumstances, despite her contribution, despite her past, what part of all this is still my fault? That's what I had to mull over. And that's the kernel of truth that you're looking for in the feedback. You don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater when you're getting constructive feedback. Because when you get constructive feedback, especially if you don't see it coming and it's a blind side, it's very easy to get defensive and think none of it's true. However, that's false. There's almost always a kernel of truth in the feedback. So the more I reflected on my wife's feedback that I was overworking, the more I discerned that I do have an issue with getting obsessive with my work. I love developing resources for couples. I love helping couples. I love thinking about it. I love setting business goals. I love setting visions for what I want my business to develop into. But I can get obsessive. I can get hyper-focused where it's all I'm thinking about, it's all I'm focused on, and everything else starts to fade in the background. So that was the part that I could own. And that has nothing to do with anything else in my life or in her life. That's the piece of it that I discerned. That's me. That's my fault. That's the piece I'm guilty of. That's the part I have to work on, and that's the part I can own. And so that's the piece I did own. I went up to her after about a day or two of mulling this over, and I said to her, I own I can get very obsessive with my work. And then I empathized, and I can see how me getting obsessive with work would make you feel like we're not having enough quality time together. And then I apologized. I'm sorry for how my tendency to get hyper-focused with work makes you feel like we're not having enough quality time together. And then I made amends. How about moving forward, I start stopping work at an earlier hour during the day, and how about on the weekends, I'll prioritize our entire Sunday to have no projects, nothing extra, nothing going on, so that we have an entire day every week to spend together as a family in addition to our once-a-week dates. That was my making amends. And she appreciated that. And that's how we made it through that complaint. If you're stuck in your relationship with resentments, if you feel walls toward your partner, if you're feeling more like roommates than lovers, I highly recommend you go through my ER Marriage Intensive. ER will help you resolve your resentments in a short amount of time so that you can start feeling hope again in your relationship. When you have active resentments, nothing else goes well. It's hard to be friends with someone you resent. It's hard to have intimacy with someone you resent. So if you are struggling with resentments and you're feeling those barriers, be sure to go through my ER Marriage Intensive. I'll leave a link to it in the show notes, and you can also go to my website and click on ER Marriage Intensive. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to click the 5 stars and leave a review. And be sure to share this episode with one other person in your life. Just click that share button and send it to a friend, a colleague, a family member, someone else that you think could benefit from becoming less defensive. And if you have questions for me about your marriage that you want me to answer on the podcast, be sure to call 303-578-0618 and leave a voicemail, and then I'll be sure to answer your voicemail on a future podcast episode. And remember, your marriage is alive. If you care for it and nurture it, it will grow. But if you deprive it and neglect it, it will wilt and die. The choice is up to you. Take care.